Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for having me here. This is my first visit to the Philippines, so I was quite pleased by the opportunity to come. So I said to myself, I've worked in the Australian electricity industry for the last 30 years. How can I make this relevant for a Filipino audience? So I did a bit of research on the map of Australia and the map of Philippines. It takes about 4.5 hours to fly from east to west of Australia. It takes about 9 hours to get here. So those maps are not to scale, so don't take them to be to scale. I also realized that there are 7,000 islands, or over 7,000 islands in the Philippines, with 2,000 of them inhabited. So that poses some challenges, I suppose, in terms of electrification. So having lived in Australia for 30 years, I said I'd find out how many islands there are in Australia. I realized that there are over 8,000 islands in Australia as well, but only a handful of them have people on it. The main island is the one you see over there, and the Tasmania at the bottom. Excuse me. So today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the Australian electricity industry, the reforms that the industry has gone through, what are some of the current issues facing the industry, what the current performance is, talk a little bit about the 3 pillars of good reform: the structure, the institutions, the rules, and the governance. And then hopefully during this exercise I might be able to give you something useful that you can take away and apply it to the Philippines electricity industry. So here we go. I hope I can drive this. Yep, I can. So Australian electricity industry went through a reform process that's not unique to Australia. I think most countries that have gone through reform have gone through a fairly similar process. We started off in the 1990s, and this slide actually gives a good perspective of my resume in the industry as well. Pre-reform, most of the industry was vertically integrated and state-owned. We had a large generation company, state-owned, transmission, distribution, and then in the States we had several distribution companies which were based on county councils or municipal councils. This is when I joined the Electricity Commission of New South Wales. That's the early 1990s reform process. During this period, the industry went through corporatization, and I guess the factor that drove this was the Australian governments, which are all state governments, quite independent, and then there is a Commonwealth government. They came together and decided that there was some serious issues with the productivity in the market, and they started a competition policy reform. And that was across the board, and I'll talk about how that followed on in the electricity industry. There were the competition principles established. There was an agreement established between all the state and federal governments called the Australian Energy Market Agreement that basically set out the rules and the principles that would apply in terms of deregulating the industry, and how the structure, the institutions, and the rules would be developed and then enforced down the track. Then came the 1990s. This was preparation for reform. So there was corporatization in the first instance. The state-owned budget utilities were transformed into state-owned corporations. There was separation into generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. And then the process for privatization started. Most of the assets that were previously owned by government were sold off, whether it was generation, transmission, distribution, etc., because the government came to the view that if the private sector could deliver these services, then there was no need for the government to be in that space. Some of the governments made a lot of money. A lot of American companies, including Texas Utilities, came and bought assets in Australia. And it's largely privatized now with some residual state ownership in generation and transmission. This was still state-based arrangements. So in the 2000s, the government started to move towards a national approach. So the jurisdictional regulators were slowly being merged into a national regulatory framework. And the privatization was completed. Phase 3 is now, I guess, current from 2010 onwards. And there has been a lot of reconsolidation in the industry. The initial reform tried to break up generation and retail and sell those to be a lot of competitive players working independently, buying from a market and then selling. Lately, there has been a consolidation in terms of the generators and retailers combining, so they have a physical hedge. So now we have vertically integrated companies competing through a national electricity market. So that consolidation is still ongoing, and I'll give you some charts on what the market shares, etc. are shortly. So making this relevant to Philippines, I mean, there are two main electricity markets in Australia. The Western Australia, the Perth region, is a small, relatively small market. You can see the sizes in terms of installed capacity, energy generated, peak demand, and number of consumers. Philippines sits in somewhere in between the Western Australian market, which is about maximum installed capacity of 5.8. Philippines around 19,000. I've seen numbers of 16 and 21, so assuming the 19,000 is dependable capacity. And then on the Eastern Australian side, there is an interconnected market from Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania, and the Australian Capital Territory. Northern Territory is currently not interconnected to any of those markets, and it's at early stages of reform at this point in time. So I guess in terms of Philippines, market size-wise, it sits between the two extremes we have in Australia. But I mean, there are a lot of characteristics in Philippines that are quite different to Australia. For example, one is we are one land mass. Philippines spread over several markets. The level of interconnection is probably not as high. And I mean, having said that, when the eastern state market started, the states weren't interconnected at that point in time. These interconnections have come in as a result of implementation of the reforms, and they have been strengthened. There are some issues of interconnection still persisting. There are weaknesses in terms of how much capacity can be transferred between islands, between the states. So they do pose constraints, and you'll see some of the issues. In terms of fuel source, I thought I'd make that comparison as well. Western Australia is coal and gas based, and some oil, diesel. Eastern states are mostly coal, with gas as the marginal generator. And I saw that Philippines has got a combination of coal, oil, and gas, largely, and some geothermal. We don't have geothermal. So in terms of fuel mix, I guess Philippines is comparatively similar to the Western Australian market. In Australia, gas is the marginal generator that sets the price at which the energy is traded in the markets. So this graph here, or this chart, shows the current status of reform in Australia. There's both gas and electricity shown there. The top bar is for electricity. The second one is for gas, so ignore that one. Most of the Australian states are now fully deregulated, both in terms of wholesale and retail competition, and also in terms of regulation and prices. The only states in the eastern market that have regulated prices are Tasmania and Australian Capital Territory. Western Australia still has regulated market for small consumers, regulated prices. Competition in Western Australia is still not complete. Only customers over 40 to 50 megawatt hours per annum are competing. And I learned this morning that Philippines is still over 1 megawatt. So the information I have was before the restraining order, I think. So prices and retail markets are fully deregulated. So I did a bit of a search of the headlines over the last few weeks. And this one sort of gives you a flavor for what the current issues in the Australian markets are, both the eastern state and Western Australian market. I guess pricing is one key issue. People are complaining about increasing prices. Western Australia, South Australia are two key states that feature on that. And you'll see something about gas in there as well. So it's also a key issue at the moment in the Australian market. Because as I said before, gas sets the prices at which the market is cleared at. And there's one slide in particular about train wreck, which sort of seems to suggest that there are serious problems in the Australian energy market. Headlines like this, and I guess when the politicians get involved, create a lot of fear and uncertainty in the market. Mr. Turnbull is our Prime Minister. You will see his name a few times. And some of the state premiers are also agitating for further reforms or looking at reining in certain aspects of the market in the way it operates. I guess the question here is whether the prices or the higher prices that are being seen, and they're not only being seen in the retail market, the wholesale prices are also going up. The question is whether this is a result of market power, whether someone's misbehaving in the market, whether it's a design issue, is the market working properly or is it clearing properly? Or is it some other factor that's contributing to the higher prices? It could also be a result of, I guess, regulators not being able to exercise their monitoring and the necessary vigilance. So hopefully through the course of this presentation, I can allay your concerns that the market's not broken yet. So the governments have, as a result of those headlines, commissioned a number of reviews. There was a recent report published on an independent review on energy security. The Finkel review, I'll come to the findings at some point. There was a retail competition review undertaken by the Australian Energy Market Commission. I used to work for that entity before I joined the bank. And there's a current inquiry by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission at the request of the government into the retail prices based on the eastern state markets, which we call the national electricity market. On the western side, there is a energy market review ongoing. There have been certain findings that have been completed, and the government is progressively, government and regulators are progressively implementing the reforms. And recently this year, the Western Australian Energy Regulator presented a report to the Minister on what they thought was wrong or what could be done to improve the performance of the market. So before I go into what needs to be done and how the market might be redesigned, I think we'll recap briefly on the supply chain and how it's set out in Australia. Generation is fully competitive. It's through clearing process. There is a eastern state, the national electricity market, and the western state markets that clear the prices for settlements. There is no regulation, no sector regulation on the generators as such. They are only subject to the national competition laws in terms of the behavior. I'll talk more about this when I come to the institutions. Transmission and distributions are seen and always seen as natural monopolies, so they are regulated. The pricing and service standards are regulated, and there is a sector-specific regulator that determines those. They also determine their investment programs for whether they are prudent and efficient, and that is the basis on which the transmission companies and distribution companies invest. And like I said earlier, these are largely privately owned as well. Retail is fully regulated, fully deregulated. Any retailer can compete for a consumer. Prices are not constrained in any way. They're set by the retailers. It's expected that the competition would ensure efficient prices. The only thing that are regulated are the standard form contracts. So these are small consumers who do not have the nous to negotiate with the large retailers. So the standard form contracts set out the basic service levels, reliability standards, etc. So they are all part of a regulated piece under the retail rules. So here, looking at the sector institutions, I've only focused on the national electricity market, and I'll try and draw comparisons to the West Australian market and the Philippines market. I talked about the Council of Australian Governments that initiated and continues to provide oversight for the reform process. Then we have the ACCC, and unfortunately I stole this chart from the Australian Energy Market Commission, which is a sector regulator. So they don't show up very well on this graph, so I'll try and point out at the ACCC. The national competition law that sits under the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. That's over there. The AEMC tried to bury them on this graph. So the ACCC is the PCC equivalent. What it does is it looks after competition law, mergers, misuse of market power, lessening of competition, consumer protection, etc. on a generic industry-wide level, not sector-specific level. Then the rest are all sector-specific regulators. The Australian Energy Market Commission is an independent entity. It's a rule maker. It makes the rules in accordance with which all participants, generators, transmission system operators, distributors, and retailers will behave in the energy market. It also undertakes reviews and makes recommendations to governments. It's funded collectively by the state government and it's totally independent of the government. It has its own enabling legislation. The national electricity objective is the guiding principle in accordance with which it works, and it, on a day-to-day basis, relies on the law to do its work. The Australian Energy Regulator is the economic regulator for energy industry. It sits within the ACCC, uses ACCC's resources, but works fairly independently of the ACCC. It sets the transmission and distribution tariffs, sets the service standards, and it's also charged with the responsibility of monitoring the market and enforcing compliance to the national electricity rules that's made by the Australian Energy Market Commission. So it's an economic regulator and compliance body. Then we have the Australian Energy Market Operator. It's again independent, and what it does is it operates the wholesale markets, and it also is responsible for system operations. It receives all the bids from generators and retailers who wish to buy, does the scheduling, publishes the prices, settles the market, and also manages the system operations. The way it signals investment is publishes statement of opportunities for where generation and transmission enhancements are necessary, and it also publishes short, medium, and long-term forecasts of system reliability, signaling where issues might arise going forward. And again, the rules within which it operates is set by the Australian Energy Market Commission, and it develops more specific procedures to undertake its work. Now, relating this to Western Australia tried to establish a market on its own and separate to the eastern state markets. So it had instead of an Australian Energy Market Operator, it had its own market operator, independent market operator. But it only cleared the market, it did the system operation functions. System operations in Western Australia was set or given to Western Power, which was the transmission company, and it was a ring-fenced entity within Western Power, something similar to Philippines, I think, where your transmission company also has the system operator. And the rules and market improvements were undertaken by a rules advisory committee that advised the government on where the reforms were necessary, and then the rules were made by the government and then implemented by government and the IMO, and implemented by the IMO and the system operator. The Western Australians have realized that that wasn't the most efficient way of doing things, so they have actually peeled out the system operation function and the market operation function, and they have transferred it to the Australian Energy Market Operator, which was the Eastern State Operator. So it now does all that. They are also reforming aspects of their rulemaking process as well. So I guess in the Philippines context, you have the ICCC equivalent, which is the PCC. Your system operator is with your National Grid Corporation. You have a ERC, which is, I think, a mix between the Australian Energy Market Commission, which makes the rules, and the Australian Energy Regulator, which does economic regulation and enforces the rules. And I think your rule change is also guided by a technical and a rule change committee. So similar, but slightly different. Which model is the best, I guess only time will tell, and you can adapt things as you go along. So I know it's a hard time of the afternoon. I can see some people finding this really hard, so I'll try and make this brief. The wholesale market design, I won't go into too much detail. I mean, the eastern state market design is similar to Philippines. It's an energy-only market, and it is a gross market. Everything that's sold in the eastern state goes through the market. It's a gross pool. So you trade all the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours through the pool. Western Australia is different. They have a capacity market and an energy market. So you not only do the megawatt hour trade, you also do a megawatt trade. And the reason for the capacity market is because Western Australia is isolated. It's not interconnected to anybody. So they felt that they needed some sort of a mechanism to ensure reliability. So they introduced this concept of also capacity market, which is a traded market again. And then you have the usual ancillary services, frequency control, network control, and system restart. Okay, that's a diagram that kind of shows what the capacity market and energy market and how they operate. In a true economic sense, I mean, in a capacity and energy market, you have the short-run marginal cost for your energy, and your capacity is your capacity. And then in an energy-only market, when the market's not constrained, you're looking at pricing based on short-run marginal cost, and as the constraint kicks in, you're looking at higher prices. And I guess the sort of theory behind, or the motivation behind establishing this market was to promote economic efficiency in terms of production, competition amongst generators, minimize the long-term cost of electricity supply, and ensure supply security and reliability over time. Energy-only markets have a concept of a value of lost load, so the markets can be priced up to that, which is $14,000 per megawatt hour. Energy and capacity market, your capacity is already priced because every retailer participating in the market has to buy sufficient megawatts to meet the demand of its consumers. So, in addition to the physical side of things, which is the electrons flowing through the system, you also have forward financial markets that are quite active in Australia. You have the over-the-counter contracts or bilateral contracts between generators and retailers. And I also mentioned that there is a vertical integration happening, so you're now getting physical hedges in addition to financial hedges. And we also have the Australian Stock Exchange running a market in electricity futures. So you can buy base load and peak futures going out monthly, quarterly, and also you can buy caps and options in the futures trade. So the financial sector is picking up on this, and they're establishing various products to allow, I guess, retailers to be able to hedge their risk in the market and provide them with some protection against the price volatility that happens on a day-to-day basis. These graphs here give you a feel for what the market shares of various generators are. These ones are only for the eastern state market. I think you'll find that the biggest generator is AGL, my previous company, with 42% in South Australia. And the rest are fairly evenly spread out. AGL kind of hogs the market in most of the cases. This is the Western Australian the pseudo measure for market share. So it's the capacity credits by each of the NEM participants. And Synergy, which is a state-owned generator, has about 50% of the share of the market. Synergy is also a retailer now. That initially, when the West Australian market opened up, they split the generation and retail. So Synergy was the generator and Verb Energy was the retailer. They kept the retail price, set a specific margin for the retailer, and made the state-owned generator where the swings in the market prices. The gas prices went through the roof and the government had to bail out the generator because they couldn't pass through the costs. Then they tried to change it the other way around. And then the retailer got stuck because they couldn't pass the wholesale cost through. So the government decided to merge the two and put them together. And I guess there are some issues that West Australia has to deal with before the market becomes fully competitive. There are, by the way, other generators participating, and they are mostly in that 50 megawatt hours per annum plus market. And in that space, the generation is reasonably effective. They do need to sort out the small end of the market and then open it up to full retail contestability. This is the Australian Energy Regulator monitors the performance of the market. So they have a number of different ways of doing this. The HHI index, someone mentioned earlier this morning, it's hovering around 2,000. I think somewhere between 0 and 10,000. Towards 0 is good, towards 10,000 is bad. So it's sitting in the middle, but I think people said that it wasn't a terribly effective measure of whether or not a market was competitive. So the AER also publishes a residual supply index. And here, if the RSI is greater than 1, it's good. The test here is whether the largest generator has the ability to influence prices. And you'll see that in all of the states, the largest generator can influence the price given those indices. I forgot to mention Australia Eastern State market is a regional market. It's settled on regions. Prices are determined by New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania. Philippines is a nodal market. I think the NEM, the regulators and NEM are thinking about nodal market. They haven't figured out how to do it. There is some value in that. It provides better price signals, helps you manage congestion a lot better. The other thing I forgot to mention is in Western Australian market, network access is unconstrained. In the Eastern State, it is constrained, which means that the generator investing in the Eastern State has to take a chance that its capacity may not be fully dispatched because of network constraints. On the other hand, in Western Australia, you build it, you get paid for capacity regardless of whether they get dispatched or not. The third measure that the AER looks at is the behavioral indicators. It looks at how individual generators behaved during period of high prices. And here you can see that when the prices rise up to about $100 per megawatt hour, generators increase output. And you'd expect that because you're getting paid more, so you want to sell more. But past $100, the output starts to fall. That doesn't necessarily mean that someone's trying to withhold capacity to drive the prices further up. That's one possibility. The other things that could be happening is that the network constraints are kicking in. Or there's some sort of constraint in the market that's not allowing the generators to dispatch their full output. So each incident needs to be looked at on an individual basis. In addition to these broad indicators that the AER publishes on an annual basis in the State of Energy Market reports, they also investigate high price events, event by event basis. So if a price hits more than $5,000 per megawatt hour in the NEM, they are required by law to investigate that and find out what caused it. Whether it was caused by some generator's behavior or there was some system constraints, design issues or whatever, and recommend solutions to that. And there have been a number of generators who've been caught out not doing the right thing because there is the rules, the sector rules require the generators to bid in good faith, which is if you bid your capacity, you are bidding it on the basis of being able to dispatch that. So if you go back and take that off because you want to influence the outcomes, then you can suffer stick penalties. And there is a session tomorrow when I will go into more detail on some of that stuff. So, this going back to word slides. So, to wake everybody up, just letting you know it's my birthday today as well. So hopefully you get some energy levels back up. Now it's the bad time of the afternoon. Okay, the good thing is you'll find in these slides, I mean, these are the investigations done following the high price events and the fear that was raised by the various media outlets. The regulators and sort of independent reviews didn't come out and point to market power as the big issue in why the markets were not working. I'll go through two reports on the Eastern State Market, the Finkel and the Australian Energy Market Commission review, and one on WA. All of them point to certain deficiencies in the market that can be fixed. What it needs is some sort of regulatory action or a design improvement to the market, or even a policy improvement to the way things are done. So the Finkel review, this was commissioned by the federal government on the eastern states. They acknowledged that the security is an issue in eastern state markets, particularly in South Australia where demand and supply are now almost balanced. So if one plant is out and the interconnector is not working, the prices will go through the roof in South Australia. So they have recommended that the regulators and the governments look at some way of ensuring security by asking generators to provide security services. It's kind of like asking for some sort of a capacity guarantee in the market. And the other thing they identified was that there is no active or very limited active demand side response in the market. A lot of large users can back off use if the prices are going too high. They can shut off their operations. But there is no compensation for them for doing so. And the Finkel review is suggesting that there needs to be a mechanism that rewards consumers to withhold demand, to stop using energy at times of high demand. So you are bidding your demand response against your supply side response to increase the efficiency from both ends. The three key pillars that the Finkel review set out was an orderly transition. And this is a hidden message to the Australian government to establish a clean energy target. I mean, they were explicit. They said we need a clean energy target. The reason here is there is a lot of new generation capacity that's not coming online because of the regulatory uncertainty around climate change. These installations will be 30, 40-year installations. There needs to be some sort of clarity around what will happen. What's happened in Australia recently is that the Labor government about 4 years ago had implemented a carbon tax. The Liberal government ran on a platform of getting rid of the carbon tax, so they won and then got rid of it. Now the Labour is still committed to some form of policy on restricting the level of carbon emissions. So if you are a generator trying to make an investment decision and you don't know what the result will be in terms of carbon price, it makes it very difficult. So one of the things Finkel pointed out, we need to put some clarity there. The other thing was they said that there needs to be more effective system-wide planning. I mentioned that AIMO already does this, but there is a need to go further and perhaps improve the planning process. And then stronger governance. They're suggesting one additional entity that will sit between the governments and the regulators, which is an Energy Security Board, to look at security issues in the NEM and do something about that. The Australian Energy Market Commission, this is the rule maker, again pointed out the high prices are as a result of lack of clarity on carbon price or some sort of a climate change response. So there needs to be some sort of emissions reduction strategy and clarity around that. The other reason was that there have been some old coal plants retired in Australia recently. And that's mainly because the owners don't want to spend any money to keep it going, because they don't know what will happen in terms of its output, especially if a carbon price comes in. And they did note that the increase in gas prices in Australia, which is LNG is now mainly exported. It's cheaper to buy gas international markets and bring it back to Australia, except we don't have a facility to get it back, than to buy it locally. So that's driving up prices because gas happens to be the marginal generator. That's the one that sets prices. The Australian Energy Market Commission made 9 recommendations. The only one on looking at the wholesale markets was to look at getting transparency around hedging contracts. Hedging contracts, this is bilateral contracts between retailers and generators, used to be monitored by Australian Financial Markets Association. They have stopped doing that. That's causing some opaqueness around how these things are traded. So they're suggesting some improvements on that. The rest of it is to increase consumer awareness and information so that consumers are able to choose more effectively. There are products out in the market that are 20-30% less than what consumers are paying on on standard tariffs. They're just not being able to access it or not doing the homework because of the transaction cost to find out cheaper prices. So that the other eye go towards solving that problem. The Western Australian market, the key issues there are conflicting governance, as alluded to that, the system operations sitting with the transmission company, rule making a little bit unclear. The other one is excess generation capacity, and this is a market design issue. Inefficiencies in markets and ancillary services, and unconstrained network access. Unconstrained network access means generators build their capacity without regard to network constraints. So networks have to naturally invest in making that capacity flow into the market, which is leading to inefficient investment. So the recommendations here are to move the market and system operator to the national energy market operator, reform the reserve capacity mechanism, an independent rule change panel, introduce full retail contestability, and then get to introduce generator access on a constrained basis. So you have to decide where you're going to invest based on what the network capacity and constraints are. So in summary, I guess competition is working reasonably well. It's a balance between competition and regulation, network assets, regulated, natural monopolies, wholesale, retail, general competition law, and then some specific sector-wise regulations noting the uniqueness of the industry. What is important is there is an appropriate market structure that drives efficiency. The market rules are effective and right ones. And then the regulators are independent, competent, and well-resourced. For investment, you need transparency, predictability, and the flexibility in rules of engagement. These are long-term investments, especially on the generation side, so we need that there. And then a combination of competition law and sector-specific regulation where it's needed to essentially prevent abuse of market.